Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Today, on Blessed Man Meditations, we continue our look through Is God a Moral Monster? Making Sense of the Old Testament God by Paul Copan. Here are the chapters in that book. Here is Paul Copan, PhD from Marquette University, Pledger Family Chair of Philosophy and Ethics at Palm Beach, Atlantic in Florida. Author or editor of over 20 apologetics and philosophy books, lives in Florida. Chapter 8 of Is God a Moral Monster? The second part of Kosher Foods and Kooky Laws. Now we're going to look at kosher laws in Chapter 8 of Is God a Moral Monster? The Hebrew word kashrut means to be proper or correct. Observant Jews will be alert to kosher food labels with the letters KSHR in the Hebrew root form on them. Israelites were to avoid foods such as pork, shrimp, and squid. Why were such foods as unclean, not kosher? The listing of clean and unclean animals is found in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. An interesting feature to these lists is that certain animals were unclean but could still be handled. For example, camels were used for transportation. The issue arose when there was death. Unclean animal carcasses rendered a person impure, not necessarily touching the animals when they were alive. Scholars have suggested various reasons for the distinction between clean and unclean. We'll look at a couple of unsatisfactory suggestions before zeroing in on a more likely solution. First, there's health and hygiene. Here's the argument. Israelites were to avoid eating vultures because these creatures eat roadkill and carnivores as leftovers. They eat the leftovers, the roadkill and the carnivores, and who knows what kind of diseases these leftovers carry, or these leftovers carry, and therefore when the vultures ingested them, they would be ingesting these diseases, so they would be carrying these diseases. We know that pigs can transmit disease such as trichinosis, while the hare and the coney and rock badger commonly carry tularemia. Shrimp couldn't be eaten because they raise your cholesterol level. That's the argument. The problem, the health idea, just isn't the concern of Leviticus 11 or elsewhere in the Old Testament. And why aren't poisonous plants considered unclean? To top it off, why did Jesus declare all these foods clean if health was really the issue in the kosher food section of the Old Testament? Also, with the association of non-Israelite religions. Here's the argument. Animals were unclean because they were associated with non-Israelite religion in the ancient Near East. Here's the problem. If that's the case, if the animals were unclean because they were associated with non-Israelite religion in the ancient Near East, if that's the case, the bull should have been an abomination. After all, the animal was central to Canaanite and Egyptian religion. Yet the bull was the most valuable of Israel's sacrificial animals. As it turns out, the Canaanites sacrificed the same sorts of animals in their religious rituals as the Israelites sacrificed. The Hittites did sacrifice pigs, however. On top of all this, ancient Near Easterners generally considered pigs detestable and typically avoided both eating pigs and sacrificing pigs in their religious rites. While Israel was to differentiate itself from neighboring nations in many respects, animal sacrifice was not one of those things. They were not to abstain from animal sacrifice. These two suggestions, therefore, health and religion, aren't good solutions. A couple of related angles will help us get an answer. Creation and the fall, death, and abnormality. Let's look at creation. Genesis 1 divides animals into three spheres. Animals that walk on the land, animals that swim in the water, and animals that fly in the air. Leviticus 11 lists as unclean certain animals that are to be connected to land, water, and air. As we've seen, these animals symbolize a mixing or blurring of categories. In contrast, the clean animal has all the defining features of its class given at creation. So animals that transgress boundaries or overlap spheres were to be avoided as unclean. Let's look at water. To be clean, aquatic animals must have scales and fins. So eels and shellfish, which don't fit this category, are unclean and thus prohibited. Let's look at land animals. Clean animals are four-footed ones that hop, walk, or jump. A clear indication of a land animal's operating according to its sphere is that it both has split hoofs and is a cud chewer. These two features make obvious that an animal belongs to the land sphere, for instance, a sheep and a goat. Camels, hares, and conies, which chew the cud but don't have divided hoofs, and pigs, which have divided hoofs but don't chew the cud, are borderline cases, so they're excluded as appropriate land animals to eat. Now let's look at the air animals. Birds have two wings for flying. Birds like pelicans and gulls inhabit both water and sky, which makes them unclean. Insects that fly but have many legs are unclean. They operate in two spheres, land and air. However, insects with 4 feet, 2 of which are jointed for hopping on the ground, are considered clean. These insects, the locust, the katydid, the cricket, and the grasshopper, are like the birds of the air which hop on the ground with 2 legs, therefore they're clean. Unclean animals symbolize what Israel was to avoid, mixing in with the unclean beliefs and practices of the surrounding nations. Israel was to be like the clean animals. The people of Israel were to be like the clean animals. They were to be distinct. They were to be in their own category, and they were to not have mixed features. After all, the Israelites were God's set-apart people who were to reject the religion or practices of the surrounding nations. But wasn't everything that God created very good? That's what God said at the end of Genesis chapter 1. If so, doesn't this mean that no animal is inherently unclean or inferior? Yes, it does. Jesus affirms this when he says that all foods are clean in Mark chapter 7, verse 19. And Jesus affirms this when it is implied in Peter's vision in Acts chapter 10. However, as the people of God, the Israelites were reminded that holiness requires persons to conform to their class as God's set-apart people. So what the Israelites did in their everyday lives, even down to their eating habits, was to signal that they were God's chosen people who were to live lives distinct from the surrounding nations. Every meal was to remind them of their redemption. Their diet, which was limited to certain meats, imitated the action of God, who limits himself to Israel from among the nations, choosing Israel as the means of blessing to the world. So, no religious overlap, blurring distinctions, or compromise could exist between Israel and its neighbors. Israel was called to integrity and purity of life to avoid what would restrict or inhibit drawing near to God. Holiness involved conformity to God's order of things. Just as clean animals belonged to their distinct sphere without compromise, God's holy people were to belong to their distinct sphere. They weren't to mix their religion with surrounding pagan nations or intermarry with those who rejected the God of Israel. Holiness wasn't merely a matter of eating and drinking, but a life devoted to God in every area. The New Testament says the same thing. While all foods are ultimately clean, our eating and drinking matter to God, who is Lord of all. That's what Paul told the Corinthians when he said, whatever you do, whether you eat or drink, do all to the glory of God. Yet food matters shouldn't disrupt the church's joy and peace in the spirit. Now we'll look at, all death and abnormality. Not only do swarming and slithering creatures cut across the 3 spheres of classification and are thus unclean, but swarming and slithering animals in any sphere, whether eels, snakes, or flying insects, were reminiscent of the fall in Genesis 3 and of the cursed slithering serpent. Yeah, they resemble Satan, who is a serpent and slithers on the ground. And so they're to be avoided because they're like him and would remind people of him. We can look at clean and unclean foods from another angle, that of the curse and death. This connection with the fall is reinforced by the repetition of God's command in Genesis 2 and 3, when God says, "You may eat," and he says, "You shall not eat." Furthermore, all the kinds of animals that were permitted and forbidden in the Israelites' diet were linked to the kind of people people God wanted them to be. They weren't to be predators in their human relationships. God's people were not. Just as discharged blood and semen symbolized death and therefore uncleanness, so did predatory animals. Do not eat the meat of an animal torn by wild beasts. Right? That was an animal that was killed by a predator. A further aspect to uncleanness and cleanness seems to be an animal's appearance. An animal with an odd-looking or abnormal appearance or feature, or one that is weak and defenseless, falls into the unclean category as well. While specific kinds of food, clothing, planting, and sexual relations in their respective spheres serve as a picture of Israel's set apartness from the nations, the distinctions between clean and unclean animals in particular symbolizes how the Israelites were to act in relationship to their neighbors as well as to God. In the language of the book of Leviticus, animals symbolize what God required from his people. For example, note the parallels between the kinds of animals offered in sacrifices in Leviticus chapter 1, Leviticus chapter 3, and Leviticus chapter 23. These animals that were offered in sacrifices were to be without blemish, which resulted in a pleasing aroma to the Lord. And the priest who offered them was to be without defect or blemish. The parallel language between the unblemished priest and the unblemished animal sacrifices is striking. Notice the italicized words, and the emphasis is Copan's in the book. So, nobody who had a defect was supposed to be a priest. No priest was supposed to be defective in that way. And you can see this was a photograph from the book. The animal had to be without defect as well. You can see that from the book. Getting more specific, Mary Douglas shows the connection between the kinds of animals that are permitted and forbidden to be eaten and the kind of people God wants Israel to be in its relationships. The theme of uncleanness in Leviticus and Deuteronomy symbolizes creation's orderliness with everything in its own sphere. So unclean animals represent a lack of wholeness or integrity and not belonging to their own sphere. Yet something more is going on. Animals that are unclean appear to be either predatory animals or vulnerable animals, those which have defect. This has a parallel to human relationships. In regard to the predatory aspect, animals of the air are forbidden in Israel's diet because they themselves have consumed blood. They're predatory. Remember, the prohibition against eating blood in Genesis chapter 9 suggests the respect of life, which is in the blood. Because the life is in the blood. As for land animals, quadruped plant eaters rather than carnivores may be eaten once their blood has been drained. The fact that they chew the cud and have split hooves, whether domestic or wild, are clear indications that they never eat blood and are not predatory. The borderline cases, the pig, the camel, the hare, and the coney, are forbidden because they fit one but not both criteria. So, land animals that are predators must be avoided because of their contact with blood. In a symbolic way, they break the law. Some scholars point out another symbolic feature. Besides unclean animals that represent predation, there are others that represent victims of predation. For instance, prohibited aquatic animals without scales and fins symbolically lack something they need. This is a picture of vulnerability. The distinction between clean and unclean animals also serves as a picture of justice and injustice in personal relationships. Copan quotes Douglas at length. Quote, the forbidden animal species exemplify the predators on the one hand, that is, those who eat blood, and on the other, the sufferers from injustice. Consider the list, especially the swarming insects, the chameleon with its lumpy face, the high-humped tortoise and beetle, and the ants laboring under their huge loads. Think of the blindness of worms and bats, the vulnerability of fish without scales. Think of their human parallels, the laborers, the beggars, the orphans, and the defenseless widows. Not themselves, but the behavior that reduces them to this state is an abomination. No wonder the Lord made the crawling things and found them good. It is not in the grand style of Leviticus to take time off from the cosmic themes to teach us that these pathetic creatures are to be shunned because their bodies are disgusting, vile, bad, any more than it is consistent with its theme of justice to teach that the poor are to be shunned. Shunning is not the issue. Predation is wrong. Eating is a form of predation, and the poor are not to be prey. End quote. What's most clear in all this is that holiness and predatory behavior don't mix. Holiness represents respect for human life, and the eating of blood, symbolizing violent death, represents predatory activity. Clean animals don't represent virtues in their own bodies, just as clean animals' bodies don't represent vices. They just follow the rule of avoiding blood. If scholars who claim that certain unclean animals symbolize vulnerability and defenseless are correct, then this representation of the oppressed, the alien, the widow, the orphan, would serve as a reminder that they ought to be respected. Israel's entire way of life, down to the very food they ate or didn't eat, mattered to God. Their diet served as a reminder of the holy and the unholy. Israelites were to avoid the unholy activity of preying on the vulnerable of society. Now we're going to look at dishonorable discharges. Why do so many Levitical laws emphasize semen and blood? Leviticus chapter 15 speaks of the emission of semen or the discharging of menstrual blood, both of which lead to impurity and the need for washing or purification. What is the reason for this? The life and death symbolism behind the uncleanness and cleanness informs us that these discharges represented what was outside the wholeness of the human body, just as unclean foods entering the body would symbolically pollute or defile. Vaginal blood and semen are powerful symbols of life, but their loss symbolizes death. To lose one of these life fluids represented moving in the direction of death. Some scholars suggest that Exodus 23 verse 19 prohibited cooking a kid goat in its mother's milk because this was a Canaanite fertility ritual. Others suggest that this is a case of clashing symbols. That is, life, mother's milk, and death, cooking the baby goat, collide in this scenario. That's an interesting point. Another such clash is found in Leviticus chapter 22, verse 28. Do not slaughter a cow or a sheep and its young on the same day. Likewise, life and death are symbolically at odds when semen or menstrual blood is lost from the body. This admixture of life and death represents a loss of wholeness. The symbolism doesn't stop here. Israel was surrounded by nations that had fertility cults. To have sex with the prostitute in a temple meant spiritually connecting with a particular deity. By contrast, Leviticus chapter 15 presents something of an emission control system. The message to Israel was that sex has its proper place in marriage. God isn't prudish about sex. God's the author of mutually satisfying sex between a husband and wife in a heterosexual marriage. As Scripture bears out in the beginning in Genesis chapter 2, and it continues in Proverbs and Song of Songs. Yet, in contrast to her neighbors, Israel needed to take seriously restraint and discipline in sexual activity. Although sex brought temporary impurity, Israel was reminded that it was prohibited in the sanctuary as part of religious ritual, unlike the sexual rituals in Canaanite religion. Again, sex within monogamous marriage is good, but adultery shouldn't be glorified by putting a religious label on it. To differentiate Israel from her neighbors, God provided certain barriers to keep sex in its proper place, rather than degrading it, no matter how pious Israel's neighbors made adultery appear. In contrast to surrounding nations, wives in Israel weren't a possession to be used for sexual pleasure. Men had certain restrictions regarding when they could have sex with their wives, which was to help give women a greater measure of independence. Boy, that's an interesting point. One of the emotional, uninformed, skeptical objections to the Old Testament God is that women were oppressed and women were unfairly treated and all of this. Notice that Copan makes the point that women were to be given a greater measure of independence, contrary to the atheistic objection. As Richard Hess points out, such protective laws had no parallels in the ancient Near East. Now we're going to look at the holiness gap, the purity laws, and the need for grace. It's so sad that the new atheists, they just completely misunderstand. They take some, they pull some passages out of context, and they make emotionally charged statements about what the appearance of these verses appears to be, and they're just so terribly, terribly mistaken. And they reject the God who loves them and who wants them desperately to be reconciled to him, and who's done everything that he could to reconcile them to him. But they won't, because they are so blinded by their hatred of this caricature that they have created. It's so very sad. The holiness gap, purity, laws, and the need for grace. Being God's chosen nation was a privilege. However, a heavy burden came with it. As the peasant Chivyi, I don't know how that's pronounced, and Fiddler on the Roof tells God, I know, we are your chosen people, but once in a while, can't you choose someone else? Now rewind to the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15. Many of the earliest Christians who were Jewish thought that one must become a good Jew in order to become a good Christian. Yes, Jesus was sufficient for salvation, sort of. But more was needed, some argued, namely Jewishness. Peter replied to this claim, even though Peter had issues with this in the beginning. Now, therefore, why do you put God to the test by placing upon the neck of the disciples a yoke which neither our fathers nor we have been able to bear? Serious-minded Old Testament Jews were regularly reminded of the gap between God and themselves. To approach God was no light thing, and throughout an Israelite's daily life were many reminders of defilement, impurity, and barriers in worshiping God. Attentive Israelites routinely experienced the holiness gap that existed between them and God. Being placed in such a position could prompt an Israelite to seek God's grace and purification on his behalf. Animal sacrifices were a small picture of this. The worshippers, priests, would place their hands on the animal. This act symbolized that an animal was being put to death in the place of humans. A substitute. Beautiful Old Testament picture of the salvation that Christ was to procure in the New Testament when he became the substitute. Sacrifice served as a reminder of human sin and unholiness and the great need for outside assistance, that is, divine grace. Some things don't change. Christ's sacrifice on our behalf is our reminder that we are sinful and unholy, and we are in need of divine grace. Richard Hess offers an illuminating perspective on sacrificial laws and the sequence of sacrifices in the book of Leviticus. First is the purification from sin offering, then the burnt offering indicating total dedication to God, then is the fellowship offering and ordination offering. These are covered in Leviticus chapter 8, Leviticus chapter 9, and Leviticus chapter 16. This helps us better understand the nature of Christian discipleship in the New Testament epistles. First comes sin confession, then dedication to God, then fellowship with God. Though Christ fulfills these sacrifices, as the book of Hebrews makes clear, these sacrifices illustrate nicely what is involved in Christian discipleship. Galatians chapter 3 mentions that the law is our schoolmaster or tutor that leads us to Christ. In other words, the law pointed forward to the ultimate fulfillment of Israel's sacrifices, the priesthood and holy days. As we've seen, such things pointed backward to Abraham, who turns out to be a picture of the need for grace apart from law-keeping. Genesis chapter 15, verse 6 affirms that Abraham trusted God and was counted righteous by God because of Abraham's faith. Notice, God declared Abraham righteous by faith even before he was circumcised and before the law was given. Living by faith, even without the law, enabled one to keep the heart of the law. The law, with all its purity requirements and sacrifices, actually revealed human inadequacy and thus the need for humans to look beyond their own resources to God's gracious assistance. However, one navigates through some of these Old Testament purity laws. The undergirding rationale behind these laws is Israel's call to live holy lives in everything. That's why the theme of holiness is explicitly mentioned in all the passages in which the prohibited food lists are given. Upon reflection, the new atheist caricatures of the Mosaic Law shouldn't be taken so seriously. We need patience to understand what's going on with the Old Testament's Levitical laws, and we shouldn't see the law as the ideal standard for all humanity. However, we'll continue to see how it shows a greater moral sensitivity and marked improvement over ancient Israel Near Eastern law codes. The Old Testament law shows a greater moral sensitivity and marked improvement over ancient Near Eastern law codes. Contrary to new atheist objections, God's ways were an improvement of nations during that time. God's ways were an upgrade over the surrounding nations. But they don't consider that, sadly. So next time we're going to look at chapter 9, where we look at barbarisms, crude laws, and other imaginary crimes, punishments, and other harsh realities in perspective. So thank you for tuning in to this episode of Blessed Man Meditations. Please consider supporting my ministry by purchasing the published work, on the first 30 chapters of the Book of Psalms, Pinnacles and Plateaus, Meditations with the Psalmist. Please pray for this ministry, and hope you have a blessed rest of your day.